This is Zen Stories, a podcast about the journey of inspiring leaders and entrepreneurs in their journey of building leading businesses and organizations. Today, we'll be chatting with Xendit's very own founder and CEO, Moses Lowe. Xendit is a payment gateway that helps businesses get paid. Xendit's mission is to make payments simple and to build digital infrastructure for businesses to succeed. Hi, Moses. Thanks for joining us on this beautiful day. See that you're in the States and it's still bright. What time is it there?
It is, let's see, it's 5:30, but I've got a bunch of lights behind me, so in front of me, so.
Well prepared for this call.
For the session.
Well, it's 7:30 here in Jakarta. So this is actually a very interesting Zen Stories episode where the interviewer and interviewee are in two separate places on Earth. So that's awesome. Work from home edition.
Yeah.
All right. Today we're going to get to know Xendit a little bit more. What's Xendit's history? How did it come to be? Why did you start it? What was the initial idea? When did you start it, and who was this with?
I'll rewind pretty far, I think. I remember when I was 13, our primary school teacher would make us play games. And one of the games was the stock market game where we would paper trade. Out of that, I came second in the class. And then we played the life game where you were paired up with someone else and then you were now a family. You had a job and you lived a life. Me and my best mate, we were the only doctors in the village, and you had to go see the doctor every now and again. Now we realized we were in monopoly, so we started charging a premium price because you had to go to the doctor, and we became relatively rich relative to our friends. Then we bought one of our friends' electronics business, and then because we were making money in the doctor business, we dropped all the prices on electronics and we bankrupted our other friend, and so we now had two monopolies. And that was that parent-teacher interview where my teacher said to my parents, maybe he likes business, and I've never looked back since. So that was the beginning of wanting to do something in business, something entrepreneurship. It was then the culmination of kind of finance and technology that I found really interesting. So I studied that in university and then really wanted to make sure that we could exercise that in the real world. The chance came when I was studying at Berkeley and got the chance to build at a hackathon, Bitcoin versus Stanford, Andreessen Horowitz hackathon. We were lucky enough to win that. And we sent money from the US to Indonesia. We thought, hey, if we can win a hackathon, maybe we should do this for real. We applied into YC, and this is 2015. Lucky to get into YC at the first Indonesian company, and then been building our businesses ever since.
Well, that's, first of all, I did not know that you were such a business magnate. So that's a very cool story, and how a young age your business instincts instilled. I think for me, it's quite the opposite. Can I have to force myself to think oh, how can I mean, you probably force yourself, but that looks very natural to me. So that's cool, and know that Xendit is in good hands. So you mentioned that you started this from a hackathon in Berkeley. Back then when you started Xendit, was it, you said send money to Indonesia. So was this the same product? Who did you do this hackathon with? And what was some learnings that you had on how to build an MVP from a hackathon, a short event?
Yeah, our goal at the time, so we knew we wanted to do something fintech. Bitcoin was cool. This is the first time Bitcoin was cool. This is when Bitcoin is still sub, I don't know, $1,000 or something. And so we thought, hey, there's this really fun use case that it theoretically should make money movement really easy. And so that's why we built it for the hackathon. And we got into YC with that idea. I remember YC asking us at the time, hey, there's other Bitcoin companies, it doesn't seem to work. Why do you think you'll make it work? And we had some great reasons, which were all wrong, it turned out, but we thought we were right at the time. When we actually executed on the Bitcoin remittance, about 6 weeks in, we realized our major assumptions, we had three major assumptions, all three were wrong. So we then pivoted very quickly. We owe this to Justin Khan, but the four of us as founders, I remember sitting in a room with him. 12 minutes in, he says, okay, why don't you guys build Venmo for Indonesia, launch within a week, and see how much you can grow. We launched within a week, and then within 6 weeks, we had 16,000 users. So that on YC demo day, we actually managed to raise some money. So I think that was really important advice at the right period in time. And we were lucky to be able to see that traction transform. I think we got to about like 200,000 users within 4 or 5 months with that product, but we quickly realized that there were massive infrastructure problems. Number one, and two, we weren't the right people to win an e-wallet game without a daily use case. So we pivoted yet again, and that was more of an embarrassing email to investors because I had to say, hey, our numbers look good on the surface, but I don't think we actually have a business, so we're going to change again. And the change happened because a friend startup, they asked how we move money so quickly. And we said, well, none of the existing players could move it as fast as we wanted, so we built our own payment stack. And they said, hey, if you give us that payment stack, we'll pay you for it. And that quickly, we built an MVP over Easter weekend, I remember. And we had our first customer live on B2B over that Easter weekend, and we've never looked back.
Wow. Yeah, I think for a lot of startups, that's always a scary thing, right? For you to invest so much time and effort in building a product and then making the decision to pivot and move over to a different product. It sounds like you guys moved really, really quickly. How big was your team back then?
So the first pivot, so during YC, we were 4 people. The second pivot, I think we were about 10. So still very small, so very easy to pivot. And then actually we had, it began a framework that we call experiments. But we actually raced 2 different things because we weren't sure which one was going to win. So we had one team build something that was more consumer based or micro SME based, and one thing that was more enterprise based. And the enterprise experiment won, and so we put all our resources into the enterprise experiment. And then that's an experiment framework we use until this day for all new products that we build.
That's really interesting. So a little bit more about that experiments framework. Could you share a little bit about what came into the decision-making process to make that pivot? Like you said, you had a pretty significant base of users who were using your product. And investors were probably thinking, oh, look, it's gaining traction. And people always wonder, like, what is the definition of product market fit? And what was it that made you say, hey, yeah, there's none here, even with this like growing number of users?
Yeah, I remember asking Justin Khan, the founder of Twitch and a YC partner at the time, what does product market fit feel like? And then also one of our other advisors, Rob Chandra. And the feedback I got was, product market fit feels like you're drinking from a fire hose. There's so much organic demand for what you build that you cannot handle the volumes. That's what product market fit feels like. If you want to quantify it, for YC, they talk about 7% week on week growth, or which is roughly 30% month on month growth, which is now the internal hurdle we use for experiments. But what we found with the B2B infrastructure business was it was such an easy sell that once we explained to people what it was, more people were just signing up. And I think our first 2 years, our sales team was like less than 3 people big, because it was just customers who were referring their friends to use us over and over and over again. And so that's really what product market fit felt like. And we grew consistently fast with zero marketing, negative marketing probably, and a very small sales team.
That's really helpful to know. Thanks for that. I think a lot of startup founders would appreciate, I think, also the quantitative number, because sometimes you never know like how much is enough to say it is a fire hose. To some people, it might depend on their team size as well. But knowing like you said, you guys were like a team of 10 by that point. So I think for an MVP, that is quite a large-ish team. So
for the experiment that we competed, we actually had 8 people on the consumer thing because we thought that would take more effort. So there's only two people. Now it was me and Bo, so it was me and the CTO on the enterprise thing, and it was like the rest of the people on the SME thing. But in terms of like MVP, it was the first ever version was built in 4 days for the APIs for disbursements over Easter weekend, and it was pretty bad, but it worked, and we managed to make it better over time and keep customers coming in.
That's really cool. And let's talk a little bit more about the industry at which you guys are currently serving in. So you mentioned that Xendit's model is a B2B model. So what is the space that is so, like you said, you just had an inflow of people coming in, like that as product market fit, and you see that with Xendit right now. Why do you think that what Xendit is doing is so perfect and compatible for the space or industry that you're in?
When we came in, what we cared about from a consumer application point of view was to be able to send money quickly. So there were payment gateways at the time. Our competitors still exist. You could kind of receive funds, but it wasn't as nice an experience as we expected, having studied overseas. And then on the payout side, the ability to disperse funds, there were no APIs for doing that. I remember a few people at the time said, why would you do that? There's no demand for that in Indonesia. And I think they were right. There was no demand. But when you look at around the world and you say, hey, in every internet economy, digital economy, developed economy, you see the ability to disperse funds at scale. We said there must be a use case. And sure, Indonesia will have a localized version. We don't want to just bring stuff in from outside. Right. But the payments problem is universal, the need and desire to be able to send funds at scale. Now, it turns out that's important for remittances, payroll, paying suppliers, lending businesses, refunds for e-commerce, all kinds of different use cases, but it just didn't exist at the time. So we said, hey, let's go and build that infrastructure. And that's been our history, is that so many of the products that we have launched, we have been first in Indonesia to ever launch that product. And we've seen the customers like it and the market grow from there. So API disbursements, batch disbursements to all the banks, dynamic 3DS by default. These are some of our history of building the first products for Indonesia.
So what would you say is like the first mover's advantage? Is that real? Like just for startups to think about, should they go into a space where there are existing people building the same products?
Yeah, my previous life was at BCG and Amazon. So first mover advantage is in textbooks, but I think is really hard because I think there's significant first mover disadvantage. The disadvantage is, one, you're the one educating the market about what this is. And secondly, because you're at the forefront of innovation, you have to make all the mistakes. Whereas a fast follower can easily see what's working, copy, and then push. And I remember working with a client in the BCG days whose strategy was they were purely fast followers. They didn't want to innovate. They just wanted to build faster than anyone else once a product was working. So I don't know that we have a massive first mover advantage. I do think that because our tech takes a long time to build, because we're building infrastructure and pipes, it's hard to copy a road or highway that you build between two cities. It takes time. So that is definitely there. But for us, it's about how do we maintain ahead of competition all the time in product. And that's how we win over the long run.
So it's not just about like when you start it, but really the reliability of the system and like taking time to build products that people want, I think is what Y Combinator's like motto for all their startups are.
Build something people want, yeah.
Build something people want, exactly.
There's a nice graph framework, I think, of this. Like if you think of x-axis as time and y-axis as like value provided by a product. If you're first, that's great. You're like further on, a little bit higher up on the y-axis and earlier on in time, so you're starting. But what's more important than having started is the slope of your curve. Because if you have a higher slope, then your ability to innovate or build product is much higher and time is in your favor. If you have a lower slope relative to competitors, then time is not in your favor, because even if a competitor starts lower down in that value chain, if they have a faster slope, they will at some point become above you. So I think that's the way I think about us is, yes, we want to start early, but I care more that our slope is higher compared to our competitors.
What would you say are the biggest factors in determining the slope?
People, I think, is the most important thing. And then there's implications of that. So I think people being how fast can you develop product? How well can you understand customers? How fast can you build something people want? And that all comes down to the people you have in your org. The implications are like, how do you do customer research? Or how do you validate ideas? How do you make sure you have enough money to hire the best people, et cetera, et cetera? But it all comes down to people.
That's good. People is in the heart of everything. I think that's also something that Indonesian companies and startups are starting to move towards as well. You know, like making sure that they're treating their people well so that they can attract the best talent in the industry. And it's always exciting for, I think, talented people to join a space that is exciting. So what would you say are some of the most exciting aspects of being in the fintech industry?
In 2015, it wasn't exciting. I remember saying we're in fintech and people were like, what's fintech? Is that like e-commerce, or like, why aren't you in e-commerce? Now it's cool. Now it's sexy. So fintech is a cool thing right now. And I'm sure in a few years it won't be. Something else will take hold. For me, fintech is exciting. I think of it in Venn diagrams. So one part of the Venn diagram is willing and one part of the Venn diagram is able. I'll talk about able first. To be able to build fintech or financial services infrastructure, you need to combine regulatory ability, competitive dynamics, the ability to sell customers, and tech all together. And that's actually, at least in 2015, a very small group of people. To be able to execute at VC pace, grow at VC speeds in Indonesia. The second part of that Venn diagram was then willing. And what we found was there was a lot of great people around, but they wanted to stay wherever they studied overseas, or they didn't want to come home yet. And so we were really excited about the idea of, hey, we think that we're able to do this and we're willing to come home. Let's go and build it. So it was exciting from an early standpoint in 2015, before any of this was cool, to say, let's go build for our region, for our countries. So that's why infrastructure. Kind of why like financial services or payments. I like things that are not ostensibly sexy. I think a lot of startups still focus on consumer or things that have you in the newspapers every day. What makes me most happy is when I was driving in from the airport into our office, and I saw like 7 or 8 billboards in a row, and all of them were our customers. I think that makes me super happy, because for us, it's about how do we build the highways so that other people can race the cars? Because without the highways, you can't race the cars. So how do we make sure that we can empower the region's next unicorns so that they don't have to worry about all the rubbish that is in the infrastructure underneath? We can abstract away all that complexity and make really simple APIs on top. We launched a product recently, and the numbers came in after week 1 that I think like 400 customers had used it. Now, in our case, we're not consumers, so consumers were much more, but 400 merchants had used this product, and it had touched probably thousands or tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of actual people with this product. But that's cool. I think to be able to, when you're infrastructure and you build the road and you see all the traffic that's going through, that's all because of what you've built. And I think that's super exciting, though it means you're not in the newspapers every day, which is totally fine by me.
Well, since you aren't, like in the limelight so much in the consumer point of view, maybe it's a little bit harder for people also to understand what are the main challenges of a B2B business. So do you mind sharing a little bit about what you find are the most challenging aspects so far?
Yeah, specifically B2B. I think the first thing that immediately comes to mind is people. I think building the right organization is really hard. I think those of us who work in tech in Indo are so lucky, because there's so much demand for what we can do. as tech folks, and the country so desperately needs more devs, more business people, more people in tech. So it's been difficult, definitely difficult in the early days, and still now, to find the right people, right culture fit, right skills. So that's always one, but I think that's universal across all startups. I think for B2B, the additional complexity is around when you lose a consumer customer, there's probably another one right next to them that you can onboard again. In our world, where we're B2B or enterprise, you lose one customer, it's massive because there's only hundreds. You measure your customers in hundreds or thousands, not in millions. So I think it becomes more important. You approach things differently. Your risk reward framework's a little bit different. And so you tend to bias towards things like reliability, making sure you can fix issues well, versus moving fast and breaking things. So I think that's a B2B challenge specifically, which is different than how millennials think. By default, we're just like, sweet, let's try to do this. Let's go launch. Let's go nuts. Whereas in our world, you sometimes have to slow down to speed up.
So that's interesting how your challenges as a B2B company is different from probably other companies that are B2C. What would you say is different about your business model besides, the risk framework that you use, to share a little bit more about how Xendit even does business and how that falls into your company's long-term goals and vision?
Sure. So the question is around goals and vision. Is that correct?
Yes, and the business model of...
The business model. Okay. The way I see our business is as the mission statement we have is build digital infrastructure for Southeast Asia. So let me break those down, and then we'll talk business model after that. Infrastructure, when we look at, or digital infrastructure, when we look at developed economies, other economies around the world, internet economies, you see that there's infrastructure that must exist. Some of that infrastructure is global players will win, and some of that infrastructure, local players will win. So here's some examples of infrastructure. Within financial services, payments, credit risk, invoice, billing, taxation. Other bits of infrastructure, email, cloud, CRM software. Now, some of those global players will win. CRM, email, global players win. But some of those bits of infrastructure, hyper-local wins. Taxation, payments, credit risk, invoicing, some of these other bits and pieces. And so for us, it's for our region, for Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, how do we think about building the bits of infrastructure that our economies need to move into the next century? How do we make sure that we can empower the next unicorns to be able to start without having to worry about any of these infrastructure pieces, having to rebuild from scratch? So that's our mission. In terms of how that comes into a business model, for us, I think that payments eventually ends up going to zero. It's a commodity. Payments at some point breaks down into, and we want to be part of that. We want to drive it to zero because that helps the overall economy. If the cost of payments is zero and payments are frictionless, then you have money flowing everywhere. Velocity increases, good for the economy. For our business, what we want to then do is then help build value-add services on top that our customers care about, that our merchants care about. And we will look to then monetize those things and say, hey, yes, use this for payments, but what about other services? And we see this around the world. We've seen Square go to Square Capital, Stripe to issuing Razorpay to Razorpay Capital. So the examples around the world where payments businesses go into other verticals or other value-added services on top, and that's how they end up making their money. So I think that's a business model part. For us, we're still very much in the early stages. We're still in the let's fix payments. Indonesia, Philippines, in the region, we're still trying to fix so much of just the basic infrastructure level, but eventually we'll have to think about at scale, how do we solve for these other services on top?
So last question, Moses. If you were to go back to your 15-year-old self, it's already like winning at Monopoly games, but go back to like a past self and give yourself some advice about building a startup, what would that be? And what are the steps and advice you would tell yourself?
There's two paradigms I would tell myself. There's two specific frameworks that change the way I think about the world that I learned in Silicon Valley, and I think they're super important. And then I'd give myself certain pieces of advice, which is mainly YC. So the two paradigms. One is we get taught in school and operate on the assumption that the world is a normal distribution. What we find in reality is that a lot of the world, the business world, is a power law distribution. And by that, I mean, so x-axis is like people competing and y-axis is value of those people. The easy example is, who's the fastest sprinter in the world? Do you know, Hillary? Who the gold medal winner for the 100-meter sprint is?
Usain Bolt, don't hate me.
Right. No, that's perfect. Do you know who the
Okay.
silver medal is?
Usain Bolt's brother.
So we all know, well, most of us have heard of Usain Bolt. Most of us don't know who that silver medal is. But the difference between those two is like 0.4 of a second.
Oh.
And the difference in value in terms of how much they get paid is like multiple orders of magnitude. Usain Bolt has tons of, I saw his ad on Instagram just the other day, but the silver medal, we don't know who that is. So much of the value and the reward in this world goes to the very top, not to the long run. And that's super important for business. And there's two things that implications. One is you don't have to be that much better than the competition, but you do have to be a little bit better. So that's encouraging. But the second is, if you're not the best, you might as well nearly not compete. So if you're going to play a game, be the very best that you can be. So that's a two from the first framework. The second is, think of x-axis as time and y-axis as value you provide. For simplicity, I'll say like dollars earned in your career. Most people earn the most money between, I think, like 55 and 65. So at some outer year. Now, what's the difference between, you're at the same point this year, no matter if you earn, let's say, $1 million a year when you're old, or let's say $10,000 a year when you're old. What's the difference? So there's lots of volatility in between, but it's the average gradient of that. So think a lot about how do you change the gradient of your life, not whether today you're being paid more or slightly less, because today's more slightly less is not important compared to 30 years from now, more or slightly less. And so optimize, I see so many young people optimize, well, I'll be slightly paid more in this job. Or they'll optimize for like a title or something, because that's a totally wrong optimization. The optimization should be, where can I learn the fastest? Because that's the fastest way for you to change the slope and trajectory of your life. So those are two paradigms that I learned in Silicon Valley that change how I think about the world. Some YC advice for those of us who are starting companies. YC says, build something people want. Most people don't do that. They build what they want and then hope that someone will buy it and pay for lots of Google ads so that someone will buy it. Do the reverse. Fall in love with the customer, fall in love with the customer's problem, and then go fix that problem. It's consumer, business, doesn't matter. Go fix that problem. If you go fix people's problems, they tend to pay you for it. You tend to grow fast. That's one. There's lots of, I think there's a lot of distractions in startup life. So my second one would be, YC spends so much time saying focus, focus, focus. They force you to come, at least in my day, force you to go to Silicon Valley. They have things like don't go to conferences. They have things like don't have parties and don't have friends. If you're serious about this, if you want to be a founder and you're serious about this, you give up everything and you focus on this for the first, until you find at least product market fit. But I find like a lot of startup founders try to do this part-time, try to like do two startups at once. Just most people can't. Some people point to like Jack Dorsey or something, but I mean, Jack Dorsey's 1 in 6 billion. So most of us are not Jack Dorsey. So I think I'll stop there. But those are like two, I think, super important things. Build something people want and focus.
Nice and concise. Well, thank you, Moses. Thanks everyone for listening to this episode of Zen Stories and watching, if you are watching our video. This is Zen Stories, and that was our talk with Moses Loh, founder and CEO of Xendit.
Thanks, Hillary.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for listening, and tune in next time to hear more inspiring stories with Zen Stories.